You see this?
Yes.
Okay, it's 10 after the hour, so I'm gonna gavel us in. All right, so today we have Professor Zara Anwarzai with us from Simon Fraser University, who will be giving a talk titled, "Where Does Labor Fit into the Philosophy of Skill?" Please join me in welcoming.
Cool. Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And thank you especially to Will for the invitation. It is just such a pleasure to be here at U of T, and this is new work, so I'm very much looking forward to talking to you all about it. So this is a project about the philosophy of skill, which I think is a really exciting and interesting area in philosophy, which cuts across some of the kind of traditional questions in philosophy of action, philosophy of mind, social epistemology. And it's also a relatively newly developing field, albeit with some really important roots, for example, in like Plato's concept of techne or craft, or Gilbert Ryle's 1949 work in the concept of mind, where he introduces famously a distinction between practical knowledge and propositional knowledge. For example, knowing how to ride a bike isn't explainable in terms of propositional facts. It's more about the kind of disposition, the embodied disposition involved in knowing how to do that. And Ryle's work has especially shaped some of the contemporary debate in this area. Okay, so just to say a bit about my own background here. So I'm a philosopher of action and a cognitive scientist. And my first entry into the philosophy of skill was an interest in what is going on in the minds of skilled performers. So what is the phenomenology of skill? What kind of mental states are involved in skill? How do we learn skills, and how does it change our perception? So these kind of like mindy questions were really how I came into it. Though arguably, I would say most of the literature on skill intersects with these kind of mindy questions. There's also work in social epistemology about experts, what counts as competence, work about why we should trust experts, that sort of thing. So today I will be talking about the relationship between labor or workplace skills, I'll kind of use the two interchangeably, and the philosophy of skill. So again, the literature on skill, extremely rich. It focuses on a really broad range of skilled action. So Gilbert Ryle talked about the knowledge states involved in playing the piano. Hubert Dreyfus focused on the kind of stages of skill acquisition and the corresponding phenomenology involved in something like playing chess. Jason Stanley talks about the knowledge states involved in something like catching a fly ball in baseball. Barbara Montero talks about the kind of control involved in something like ballet. Who else? I'm trying to think. Yeah, Judith Martins. I mean, the list goes on, right? Judith Martins talks about also dance, right? Doing things like tango and the waltz. Jonathan Birch talks about things like the cognitive modeling involved in something like stone tool making. David Papineau talks about things like cricket. The list goes on and on. I'll stop there. But from this literature, again, we get this really wide range of skills, including sports, arts, maybe what we might call domestic skills like cooking or knitting, or making tools, and leisure-related skills like games. So this otherwise incredibly rich literature on skill has a pretty glaring omission. That is, there's a near total omission of what I'll call workplace skills from the philosophy of skills. So by workplace skills, I mean skills which are acquired and expressed in kind of like standard workplaces. So putting together parts on an assembly line, or making judgment calls as an air traffic controller, or following a delivery route on a set time schedule, navigating unexpected obstacles as they come, typing in data entry, operating machinery. These are all examples of skills which one learns and performs in workplaces such as factories, warehouses, industries such as transportation, agriculture. I'd say standard workplaces because most people in the world have jobs like that. So I think this omission is pretty jarring, and if left unaddressed, potentially damaging for the philosophy of skill for both inquiry-related reasons and I think political reasons. At the very least, workplace skills, I think, introduce a wide range of considerations for skill acquisition and expression, which have not been considered in the literature to this point. From questions about the phenomenology of skill expression under conditions of precarity or uncertainty or fear or surveillance. So like working while you're being watched, for example. Uncertainty in terms of like job security, right? How one might change or modulate their skill expression in response to concerns about whether or not their contract is being renewed. There are also questions about how we approach skill expression when there are kind of external considerations about skill evaluation, which don't necessarily seem to do with the performance of the skill itself. For example, the way that we might evaluate a doctor's diagnosis based on its alignment to insurance codes. So I think that, we're kind of leaving like inquiry related money on the table when we don't look at the workplace. And that's like the very like least of our problems. There are also these kind of like bigger political stakes in the omission, which hopefully will become clearer as this talk goes on. So thanks for allowing me this kind of extended introduction. This is still the introduction, by the way, which hopefully offers some useful context. So now let's get into the meat. So this talk is part of a broader project to understand the significance of the omission of workplace skill from the philosophy of skill. So today I'm going to be focusing on one area where I think that this significance is especially salient. I'll be looking at how we understand within these kind of philosophical approaches what makes skill good, and introducing some considerations about workplace skill, which I think problematizes those existing approaches. So I'm using good in a pretty vague and under-theorized way here, mostly to capture some kind of distinct but connected ideas within the literature for responding to this question of what makes skill good. But roughly, we're talking about good in the neighborhood of what gives to skill its kind of special status in society, right? Why is skill important for human life? Why is skill important for human culture? So I will advance my case in 4 parts in what follows. First, in part 1, I'll say a bit about what skills are, as understood both within and beyond the philosophy of skill. In part 2, I'll say more about the omission of workplace skills from the philosophy of skill. In part 3, I'll highlight how workplace skills might challenge our philosophical understanding of what makes skill good. And then in part 4, I'll very briefly sketch out my positive project. So I think that if workplace skills can tell us what's limited about current approaches, it'd be great if they could also help us figure out what a more fruitful or revised approach might look like as well. Okay, so moving into part 1, what are skills? So in the context of a discussion about workplace skills, I think it's quite natural for our minds to first go to the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. In sociology and economics and labor studies, these are the disciplines which are thinking about how the term skill operates in our kind of everyday lives. There's a real distinction, like a real division between approaches which take skill to be an extrinsic versus an intrinsic feature of an activity. So within the skill as an intrinsic feature of an activity camp, there's a few distinct approaches to making this claim. So some look at skill in terms of task complexity. So skilled labor is, on this type of approach, just sufficiently complex labor. So the clearest kind of examples of such ideas come from systems such as Canada's National Occupation Classification System, or NOC, or the US's Dictionary of Occupational Titles, or DOT. So the DOT, which I'm more familiar with, both because I'm American, so some jump scare, and because I think it offers really explicit measures of complexity. So the DOT measures task complexity in terms of 3 different metrics. Data complexity, so how much information you handle on the job and what the kind of nature or character of that information is. People-related complexity, so how many people you interact with, what the character and intensity of those interactions are, and things, so what kind of tools you work with on the job. So per these sorts of measures, labor is skilled when it reaches a certain threshold of complexity across one or some combination of these different dimensions. So work like being an Air Canada gate agent is considered skilled because it involves different forms of complex activity, from interactions with people to the usage of technical communication and informational systems. So other approaches to taking skill as an intrinsic feature of an activity look at it in terms of the kind of competence required to do certain tasks. So the more training or experience a job requires, the more of a skill that job is. So while we can use things like education, training, job experience, also as things which allow us to attribute skills to persons. For example, education gives you skills, job experience gives you skills. A person with education and job training is skilled. We can also use it to track what makes a particular job a skilled one. So it's this latter interpretation which treats skill as an intrinsic feature of an activity, but simply identifies activities as such based on the kind of competence assumed to be necessary to carry out such activities. So teaching university students, for example, is thought to require so much training because it is a skill. So many sociologists and political theorists have argued that skill is actually an extrinsically determined, often feature of an activity, often relative to the social and economic context in which an activity is expressed. So Natasha Iskander did a study put out in 2021 of migrant workers in Qatar, for example, which presents a case for skill as being flexibly attributed to labor based on strategic considerations, pretty much about cheap and fast labor, right? Rather than on any kind of inherent feature of the kinds of tasks involved in certain jobs themselves. So constructing a building, for example, in most North American contexts, is considered to be a pretty complicated endeavor, which requires a big team with a diverse set of skills, from masonry to plumbing, all of which are sort of treated, most of which are treated as skilled trades. And in the context of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, migrant workers were brought in from countries like Bangladesh to do the same kind of like building construction work under the label of unskilled workers doing unskilled labor. The label of skill, sort of in this case, was through a variety of kind of like institutional maneuvers shifted to describe a type of worker doing a type of activity that would have in another context been described as skill, straightforwardly so. So the label of skill comes in these cases from who you want to do your work and how much or how little you want to get away with paying them, pretty much. So in a similar vein, but kind of coming from the opposite direction, is this idea that industry-wide labor power can also determine extrinsically what counts as skilled labor. So Paul Atwell in 1990 described what he called a neo-Weberian approach to understanding skills, wherein, quote unquote, monopolistic powers, labor unions, professional associations, quote, enable an occupation to restrict its size and hence force an increase in the price of its services, which also assists the claims of that occupation to high skill and thereby high status. He goes on, requiring lengthy periods of apprenticeship or training and slowing or discouraging the entree of new practitioners help build a public perception that the work requires exceptional knowledge and preparation. So when electricians or carpenters fight for companies to hire union labor only on the basis that union workers kind of are better trained because unions have the monopoly on the educational resources within that industry, they position themselves to ensure and retain their status as workers engaged in skilled labor. So as Atwell also points out, some traditional Marxists have taken a similar line on skill. So Eric Hobsbawm writes that skill is defined based on worker power. Somewhat interestingly, Marx himself, notably if you've sort of looked into it, has treated the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor as ultimately kind of orthogonal to his labor theory of value. In Capital, he writes that we should analyze all labor as simple unskilled labor, presumably because there's no functional difference between how the two function on that theory, on that labor theory of value. So despite Marx's own sparse writings on this, traditional Marxists such as Harry Braverman have, in 1974, he offers a supplement to Marx's account of craft mastery in Braverman's own account of skill. So Paul Atwell again describes Braverman's account as fusing Marx's historical account of loss of skills with his account of alienation. And this is so because on Braverman's account, control is really central to skill, as it is central to alienation. So to be skilled on Braverman's account, you have to decide how to do your work. You have to choose your work. You have to be self-directed in your work. This notion of control seems to also figure into some of the philosophical accounts of skill, a point which I'll come back to later on. So the debates on skill within the philosophical literature are less concerned with what skill is and more concerned with the kinds of attributions we can make about skill. So there's intense debate within this literature, just to give you like a brief sense of it, about the kind of knowledge states we can attribute to skill. There are on the one hand the intellectualists, people like Jason Stanley, Timothy Williamson, Carlotta Paveza, and then on the other hand the anti-intellectualists, people like Hubert Dreyfus, Gilbert Ryle, Evan Riley. So the kind of basic intellectualist line is that skill is a disposition to generate action guiding knowledge, and that knowledge is propositional. Action guiding knowledge within a given domain. So for example, a tennis player knows that her serve will land in a specific spot. The basic anti-intellectualist line is that skill cannot be captured in terms of propositional knowledge, and instead we should analyze it in terms of the kind of embodied, flexible, situation-dependent responses that skilled performers are able to do in their domain of skill. So again, the debate here is not about what skill is, but rather how to analyze the mental states involved in skill. There's an analogous debate about the kind of phenomenology of skill. So some say that the mental mark of skill is control or like focus, deliberation. Others say that the mental mark of skill is automaticity, a lack of reflectiveness. In fact, like to deliberate would interrupt your capacity to carry out action flexibly. But again, this is a debate about what skill feels like and not what skill is. So what skill is roughly on the philosophical picture is, I think, something like this. And I say I think because within this literature, there is kind of, I think, like reticence to try and identify like what exactly skill is, to identify the necessary and sufficient conditions for skill, to capture the essence of skill. But still, we have paradigmatic examples of skill within the literature. We have an ordinary notion of skill. We have paradigmatic features of skill which figure into our debates. We have good attempts to distinguish skills from habits. We have good attempts to understand the metaphysics of abilities from which we might extract a distinction between skill and ability. So I think that we can safely extract a picture of skill adequate enough to ensure that what types of things the philosophical literature is picking out is also the type of thing that we might pick out in the workplace. So from within the philosophy of skill, when we talk about skill, and this is at the bottom of page 1 on your handout, I think we're picking out activities which have at least the following 4 features. So 1, the acquisition of these activities requires deliberate practice. You have to like come to the skill and kind of like work on it to get it, at least in the initial stages. 2, the expression of the activity is an intentional action in the kind of traditional philosophy of action sense of intentional. 3, the activity is, in theory, potentially improvable, right? Whether through practice or through reason. And 4, there are standards of successful performance used to evaluate expression of the activity. So standards of performance in general, even if there's not a clear sense of a standard of successful performance. So you can say whether or not a skill expression is good, interesting, whatever it may be. So I think this is roughly what the philosophical literature is picking out. I think this is like a rough idea of a philosophical conception of skill that we might rely on. Jesse Prince offers a similar set of criteria in his paper on whether emotional recognition counts as a skill. So I feel like it's not a total shot in the dark here. So I feel good about it. But yeah, on this picture, skill is, and this is different from the kind of debates we see in the skilled, unskilled labor discussion. Skill is an activity that one engages in with a particular orientation. So it's neither about some intrinsic feature of the activity nor some social or political context of expression, which is determinative of what counts as skill. It's really about how a performer engages in the activity. Of course, there are some activities that can't be engaged with in certain ways. So, this is not like a sort of ready definition, but something that we can certainly talk about more. But I think there's something really helpful about taking this as the philosophical conception of skill as an alternative to the accounts presented earlier. So there's something at least helpful related to our inquiry and its ability to track the ordinary usage of skill. For one, I think it allows us to get a sense of why we look at highly complex activities, for example, like raising children or throwing a party, and we don't treat them as skills. And I think that's appropriate, right? We don't analyze them as such. So we can have highly complex activities, which are not skills. Similarly, it allows us to conceptualize why relatively simple activities might be considered skills. So activities as simple as breathing and eating can be skillified in a sense, right? You can work on meditation and get better at breathing. You can be a professional hot dog eater, right? Like eating, this kind of like basic instinct, you can get really good at it. Again, I'm American, so that example makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, it's for the most part about the attitude that the performers take toward the activity in tandem with some kind of socially determined notions about whether we can apply standards of performance to something such that it could be approached as a skill. So now getting into part two, the omission of labor. So first, I want to say this. It's of course difficult to prove the absence of something, but I guess watch me try. I'm not a historian, so I do think that there are likely methods available to me, which I haven't yet pursued, but which I could and which would likely help my case in this. I am, however, a millennial. So when I was first noticed this omission, I was in the early stages of working on my dissertation on social skilled action. And I sort of just thought, oh, I haven't seen any mention of work in a long time, and I've been reading for a while. So I Command-Shift-F'd through all of the kind of most cited PDFs, work by Stanley and Williamson, work by Stanley, work by Hubert Dreyfus, work by Carlotta Paveza. And again, I could do this more systematically. And I searched for labor, spelled both ways, because though I am American, I'm trying my best to become Canadian as fast as I can. Work, job, workplace, right? No results. The word work, of course, does come up, but in the context of, so-and-so's work on such and such. I will say honorable shout out to Gunnar Breivik for a 2000 article in which he talks about skillful coping as something we do in everyday life, including sport, warfare, and the workplace. But after that, he focuses on sport and no other mention of the workplace. And then there is this other mention, a similar type of mention by Capuccio in a 2023 article that I'll talk a bit about later. So you'll get the other citation that I found, which mentions the workplace. But again, he talks about, he mentions the workplace once and doesn't pick it back up. So throughout this literature, I'll admit, again, that a more like systematic review could be done. But I'm going to give you other reason to sort of believe that the omission as it is as significant and is as existent as I think it is. So even when there's like the occasional mention of work, there's certainly no treatment of skill on the job in any meaningful way. Again, we're talking about tennis, we're talking about cricket, we're talking about piano, chess, ballet, knitting. These are artistic and athletic skills typically performed in the context of leisure. So we're not talking about operating forklifts. We are not talking about scheduling shifts for part-time servers at a restaurant while managing their interpersonal conflicts, nothing like that. So we get somewhat close, at least close enough for me to bring it up before attempting to explain it away, to workplace skills in 3 areas of the literature. So the first is in using elite performers like musicians and athletes as paradigmatic examples of highly skilled performers. So here we often see real-world examples of professional skilled performers, that is, people who perform their skills as part of some professional paid work-related arrangement. So in a 2014 paper, Toner, Montero, and Moran, for example, talk about Tiger Woods, the professional golf player, who made this kind of notable decision to change his golf swing 3 times throughout his career. So in talking about Tiger Woods making this decision to change his golf swing, Toner, Montero, and Moran focus on the cognitive challenges involved in Woods having to undo highly entrenched patterns of movement. They don't talk, for example, about the, really probably important psychological challenges involved in potential career suicide, right? That's sort of in the background, you can tell in the descriptions of why one wouldn't want to change their swing, because it requires some kind of like gap in performance, but it's not actually addressed. It's really this sort of, again, cognitive challenge about undoing entrenched behavior. So I think that this analysis reflects both a failure to consider the workplace as a relevant dimension of analysis, and kind of results in our inability to properly capture a wide range of skill-related phenomena which occur exclusively in workplace contexts, or are primarily caused by workplace contexts. So a relevant case, right, for this kind of inquiry comes from this year's Olympics. So there was an American figure skater, Alyssa Liu, who came back to competition after initially retiring at the age of 16. Retiring at the age of 16. Sure, why not? So Liu reported that stepping away from the kind of professionalized setting and the kind of intense competitive setting allowed her to reconnect with the skill itself in such a way that made her a better performer. And then she came back and won a medal. So the workplace context, which seems incredibly relevant for understanding real-world cases of elite athlete skill development and expression, is, I think, potentially really interesting, and that's the dimension that's currently left out of the analyses of professional athletes insofar as it's considered. So in a second area of the literature, there's some work on artisanal skill, which could be sort of like extended to an analysis of, skill traits and workplace skills. So Jonathan Birch, who I mentioned earlier, does work on the cognitive mechanisms involved in stone tool making, which in the context of lithic stone tool making, so like early human tool making, which could certainly be generalized to a story about skilled trades today, and for example, a skill like masonry. But this work focuses on the cognitive mechanisms involved in tool making as it relates to the evolution of human cognition in an ever-changing environment where things like survival and the ability to navigate the environment were kind of the key foci. So no attempt has been made as of yet to generalize from that story anything about the mental states involved in contemporary skilled tradespeople, but it could be. So that I think is potentially promising. In a third area, and I think this is the closest we get to a real treatment of workplace skills, we have the work on the nature of expertise and what it means to be an expert. So this area connects to questions in philosophy of mind, like what kind of mental states do expert performers have, with questions in social epistemology, like what counts as competence and what role should experts stand into non-experts. So Alvin Goldman's work, especially starting with this 2001 paper on deciding which experts you should trust, has served as the foundation for the evaluation within philosophy of policymakers, scholars, scientists, medical professionals, legal analysts. In my own work in this area, I've thought about the difference between interacting as a non-expert with artificial expert systems versus human expert systems, and what that means for the status of human experts. But in my work, and like the work of others in this area, discussion of the status of human experts is mostly about the relation between experts and non-experts, and also the sort of appropriate parameters of interactions between experts. We're looking at questions like, who should I trust? Why should I trust them? What information is rational for me to accept? What does rational and principled disagreement between experts look like? And so the philosophical treatment of experts, who are no doubt exercising their skills primarily in the context of workplaces, right? Universities, government institutions, healthcare institutions. It's not at all about how those workplaces modulate any of those kinds of questions about trust, rational deference, or disagreement. I mean, to some extent, we get close in thinking about things like conflicts of interest, but those aren't so much about how the institution forces a performer to potentially modulate their skill expression, but rather just like something you should have in mind in weighing testimony. So our philosophical inquiry, it's not about these institutions, their standards, their practices, it's not about how the institutions themselves shape the participation of experts within them, and hence the skill deployment that experts do within those institutional roles. So I want to pause here just to be clear about what my accusation is. So I'm not suggesting that the philosophy of skill only focuses on like white collar, highly specialized workers or anything like that. And therein lies the problem. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, I'm arguing that, while there is, of course, a total or, whatever, maybe I'll hedge a little near total exclusion of blue collar work from this literature, and not a total exclusion of instances of skill found in white collar work. The workplace context of expression for both, but for the latter, which is sort of raised, is not treated as a relevant factor, which might bear on skill acquisition and expression in any meaningful way. So I will note, however, that the use of elite athletes, artists, highly specialized scientists, academics, policymakers, and so on as paradigmatic examples of skill performers might be relevant to our diagnosis of the omission of labor from the philosophy of skill. My goal here today is not to perform that diagnosis, but it is one of those questions that I am very much interested in as part of this broader project and would be happy to talk about more after. Okay, so moving into part 3, workplace skills and the trouble they cause for philosophy. So first, I'll say I think that there are at least 2 distinct kinds of workplace skills, and both have been omitted from the philosophy of skill. The first we might call essentially workplace skills, and those are skills which are necessarily acquired and expressed in workplace contexts. The second we might call contingently workplace skills, and those which are sometimes but not necessarily acquired and expressed in workplace contexts, but in the context of our analysis, the workplace is a relevant dimension of analysis. So for essentially workplace skills, we might think of work like operating a forklift or being a robotics technician, which requires building, testing, repairing automated machinery. Such skills necessarily take place in agricultural or industrial settings, and we have no non-workplace analog to the same or similar skill sets being performed, again, in non-workplace contexts. We might also think about the skills, again, of being like a manager at a restaurant, scheduling people's shifts and kind of managing the tension between coworkers as a sort of like essentially workplace skill. It just doesn't seem that you would ever do those things or anything that looks like those things outside of working at a restaurant. For contingently workplace skills, we might think of those involved in things like being a barista, right? You can make a good latte at home, you can make latte art at home, but you can also make it as part of your job working at a coffee shop. We might also think about those involved in moving the contents of an apartment, right? Putting things in boxes, not breaking fragile things, making sure that your boxes are not too heavy such that the boxes break or you can't carry them, fitting the boxes into a moving truck such that everything fits, right? It's a highly complicated action, which you can do as a person just moving apartments who didn't want to hire movers, or you could do in the context of your job as a mover that someone hired to move their apartment. Ultimately, this distinction, I think, doesn't matter much for our purposes today. However, given how under-theorized the notion of workplace skills is in the philosophy of skill literature, I think it's worth trying to be as specific as we can when talking about them. So now onto the trouble that workplace skills of both types cause for the philosophy of skill. So today, I want to focus specifically on the trouble they cause for accounts of what makes skill good. Again, I'm using good here in a relatively under-theorized way, terrifying thing, or unstrategic thing to do at the Center for Ethics, but yeah, here I am. So I'm using it in a relatively under-theorized way to capture a broad range of accounts on what makes skill have some kind of special status in human life. Okay, so when we ask what makes skill good, we get a few different answers from the philosophical literature. The first is this idea that there's something good about the mental states involved in skill. So we see this again in this paper by Cappuccio, where there's an attempt to use mental states to distinguish instrumental actions. First, I think we see this implicitly in a lot of places in the philosophy of skill, but here are the sort of most explicit renderings of this idea. So again, Capuccio's paper, where he attempts to use mental skills to distinguish instrumental actions from performances, arguing that in the latter, performances are the skilled thing. The mental means of action is partially constitutive of the value of the action. So I take Capuccio here to be using value in two ways, both to refer to what makes a skilled performance a good one, and to distinguish skills from mere instrumental actions, where skill is what he calls a distinctive form of human behavior. So he writes, quote, "The fine-grained details of execution, including its sensory motor and morphological contingencies, are constitutive of performance and contribute to determine their value. Whether on the sport field, on the stage, or in the workplace," we got to mention, a performance is neither merely instrumental nor value neutral, because its execution can and must be evaluated qualitatively or quantitatively in comparison to executions of the same kind, unquote. So the mental states involved in skill are valuable for our evaluation of a good performance as such, and as well perhaps functionally valuable or something like that, because they allow us to distinguish between an inherently valuable form of human behavior and kind of like instrumental, mere instrumental performance, mere instrumental actions. So the idea that mental states matter for our evaluation of performance also comes from Catherine Robb's 2021 work on talent, where she argues that talent has its own special normative status, and it is marked by effortlessness. So the two claims kind of go hand in hand. A similar idea about skill as an important form of human behavior comes from Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus's work contrasting humans from artificial skilled performers, so contrasting human chess players from a computer playing chess. So here, Dreyfus and Dreyfus argue that there's something distinctively human about skillful intuition, something which sets us apart from other species and certainly from artificial agents. So the mental states involved in skill are good because they define who we are as humans. Skill makes us human. It's actually the title of Natasha Iskander, who wrote the book on the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. That's the title of her book. And it's a good line because I think we see this over and over again in the literature, right? Skill defines who we are as humans, and it's not just defining, it's obviously kind of spelled out in some sense where we are obviously superior on the basis of having something like skillful intuition. So there's something distinctive and something good about our the mental states involved in skill. So we might also see support for the idea that certain mental states are good beyond work on skill in particular, and from other areas in philosophy. For example, Aristotle's idea that, virtue expression should be habitual, or Kant's idea that like morally worthy action should be effortful, right? And certainly from psychological work on the like affective cognitive states, states like stress are supposed to have a negative valence, states like curiosity are supposed to have a positive one, and the negative valence associated with stress is supposed to signal that stress is bad for you in some kind of health and well-being related way. Okay, so the second response we get to the question of what makes skill good comes from this idea that the good in skill lies in the way that skill offers for us opportunities for meaningful expressions of agency. So this is something that I think squarely aligns with Braverman's account of skill as the one that I presented earlier, this idea that skills involve control, self-direction, the exertion of the will, all of which are inherently important. This is something which also comes out really clearly in the work of Brent Bradford, who uses a perfectionist framework on which things are good if they contribute to the development or exercise of essential or fundamental human capacities, to argue that achievements are particularly valuable because of their difficulty. So Bradford neatly summarizes her own view, writing, quote, "Achievements are difficult, and engaging in difficult activity is intrinsically valuable. The explanation for this value lies in perfectionism, according to which the will is among our fundamental human capacities." So we have at least two responses to this question of what might make skill good. The first requires us to assume that there is a meaningful or maybe necessary connection between successful skilled performance and a certain mental state or a set of mental states. and then evaluate performances and the good of skill in general based on those mental states. The second, which I think is a bit more straightforward, is that skill expression is an important form of human agency, one which challenges us and allows us to exert our will, and these are inherently good things for humans to do. So I think that looking at workplace skills invites us to put some pressure or sort of think about the scope of application of some of these responses. So think first of the idea that the good of skill comes from the mental states involved in skill. So first, from thinking about the workplace, we might doubt the idea that there's a necessary connection between successful skilled action and, a single key mental state or any set of mental states. Famously, you can be bored on the job and still be very good at it. There's kind of active debate in how much boredom impedes capacity to do well at certain tasks. A lot of them are kind of like done in the lab. So there's not fantastic empirical data there, but yeah, there sort of seems to be an ordinary idea that you can be employee of the month and kind of hate your life at the same time. You can also be very scared or stressed while doing your job and yet be very good at it. So for example, the 2022 negotiations between UPS, the United Parcel Services in the US, and the Teamsters, delivery drivers reported working under conditions of intense fear, wondering whether their managers were secretly following them, because there were, in fact, many documented instances of managers following delivery drivers on their delivery routes to ensure that they weren't doing things like taking shortcuts because they were building files to potentially use to threaten workers' jobs or fire them. Putting a dossier of little mistakes. But still, despite this intense fear, many of the drivers got the job done on time without error. We might also think about jobs wherein performing the skills is almost always stressful. And this is just a sort of key feature of the job. So air traffic control, for example, is widely cited as an inherently stressful job. Like diffusing a bomb, we might argue, a sense of urgency and a heightened state of concentration, sometimes verging on anxiety, is key to getting the job done and doing it right. Like people talk about, there's a lot of both first personal accounts, and there's at least one ethnography of air traffic controllers, in the author's name I'm totally blanking on now, which talks about air traffic control as just like an essentially risky endeavor. Yeah, stressful thing to say before I take a flight tomorrow, but that's a stressful thing to read about. But anyways, it's essentially risky, right? It's essentially stressful. And there's no remedying this, right? Like the right way to remedy this is to just limit the hours on the job, but there's no way to make the job not stressful. So here we see a case where, okay, if we want to grant that there might be a necessary or key mental state involved in skill action, or in successful skill performance, it might be one with a negative valence. It's not clear that we should grant that it's good because skill is good, right? This sort of, it pushes on this idea that there's a necessary connection and the mental states involved in skill are good ones to have. So it's sort of not really clear whether we should grant that the good of skill should come from the mental states involved in skill. Okay, well, maybe it's not about the specific mental states, but it's about the meaningful expression of agency that skill enables. You may be stressed, but you're exerting your will, and that is inherently valuable. So therein lies the good of skill. So I think that there's something important here, and I, as a human, love to exert my will. So at the same time, I do worry about whether or not this comes from a kind of overemphasis in the literature on artistic, athletic, and leisurely skills, which might have led us to the mistaken assumption that performance of skill sort of like always or even tends to involve meaningful expressions of agency. But when we think about the workplace, we think about examples of people who get very good at things against their will. So every day, people in this world show up to jobs they don't like and don't want to have, and they do work that they neither care about nor are self-directed in, and they do a great job. So servers can learn to balance trays of heavy dishware without falling because they have to. Someone on an assembly line can learn how to put together plastic parts faster than before because they have to, and they can do a really good job, and they can innovate, and all the kind of like markers of a successful performance might be there. If we grant that there are many instances of skill performance which don't involve meaningful expressions of agency, or inherently, good exertions of the will, then I think that we might lose this as a basis for thinking about that as part of the good of skill. Okay, so moving now into this final part, where I'm just going to really briefly lay out this quite early stage positive account. So I do think there's something good about skill, and I think its special status in human life is well-deserved. But I do think our best attempts to locate and understand that good aren't accommodating enough to the wide range of conditions under which workplace skills are performed. And I think that is a problem for such accounts, because workplace skills really are skills. And so I'd like to think that at least some of the good of, for example, playing the viola might also be reflected in the good of being a barista or something like that. I do suspect that, and it is a suspicion at this stage, that a potential problem underlying our current responses to understanding the good of skill is that they might be too individualistic, in the sense that we're looking for the good of skill relative to individual mental states. We're looking for the good of skill relative to individual expressions of agency. And maybe we should be looking at the good of skill relative to something like a collective expression of agency, collective agency. So maybe the good of skill is something we have to instead understand at the collective level. Thinking back to something that came up in my sort of early days of looking into the philosophy of skill, are these perspectives from the evolution of skill, where there are aspects of our contemporary conceptions of skill, specialization, innovation, which are thought to have evolved and developed as our social worlds became more complex, where divisions of labor and creative engagement with the world were needed. So I think that maybe the good of skill lies in what skill enables us to do with others. It allows us to build things together, to entertain each other, to educate one another, to assist each other, and to develop both our social and our physical world. Now, we need not use skills for good aims, and sometimes we don't, but insofar as there's any inherent value to skill itself, it might be in its socially enabling features. Skills, whether at work or in leisure, are means through which we can offer distinctive contributions to our world. So speculative as it is, I hope that this is a fair starting point for, a revised or developed account toward the good of skill, one which importantly does not neglect what good, if any, there might be also found in workplace skills. Thank you all so much.